today's episode, we welcome Tyler Lund, an executive at Veris Technologies. Tyler has a wealth of experience in on-the-go soil sensing and has been involved with Veris Technologies since the company was founded.
Tyler's dad, Eric Lund, founded Veris Technologies in 1995 during the onset of precision ag technologies for vehicle positioning and variable rate application. In Tyler's current role, he helps direct their business strategy and identify new opportunities for Veris to help growers optimize their operations.
Tyler will discuss the history of Varus and his role in more detail in the episode, but he will also break down on-the-go soil mapping, the differences in types of sensors available on the market for soil mapping, what exactly mapped soil data is useful for, and how users can derive their maximum benefit from the technology.
There's a lot of great content in this episode for you to listen to, so let's jump right in with Tyler Lund.
So I guess, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your background and what you do with Veris Technologies?
Yeah, so my name is Tyler Lund, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing at Veris. And I think if we were a Silicon Valley company or more progressive with our titles, I think my title would be Director of Business Development or something like that, because I do try to help sell our equipment, but a lot of it is product design, understand what sensors and what configurations are going to be most helpful for growers and their advisors. A lot of my job involves helping people who buy our equipment make use of it. And a lot of people are starting businesses with this. So an advisor would get our equipment and start mapping for customers. And so some of it's just helping them launch a business. But a lot of it comes down to folks using this new high resolution soil data for unique applications. And we got equipment in, I think, 54 countries right now. And so helping people, who want to improve yields, improve, probably more importantly, profitability in a lot of different settings, because the soil varies in all these different countries where the sensors are being used. But one of the challenges, we've got kind of some textbook agronomy, and we need to learn how to apply it site specifically. And with that comes a lot of neat opportunities. I think one of the most rewarding thing in my job is when people can approach problems that have plagued farmers for a while with a new twist by maybe new inputs, new products are available that didn't make sense on a cost scale across the whole field. But now when we can target it in certain regions, like I think you probably suffer from some iron deficiency chlorosis. I think they call them the Platte Valley yellows or something like that. And these high pH, poorly drained areas, throwing chelated iron there, some varieties of soybeans that they can just target with a multi-variety planter or different populations. So coming up with some of those agronomic solutions is my favorite part of my job, for sure. So that's a little bit about my role at Veris.
Cool.
That's awesome. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the background of Veris and how the company started and where it's going?
Yeah, Veris got started in 95. I think when we first started kind of putting together some of the ideas, first product was launched in 96. It really all came out of this. At that time, this is the advent of precision ag, right? GPS was just made available to the public. And manufacturers were making variable rate equipment, controllers. But the question was, all right, we now have the ability to manage these different areas in our field, but how do we know where they are? How do we digitize that? And at that time, the USDA soil survey hadn't been digitized. It was in the process of being made, geo-referenced. And grid sampling was coming on, but farmers really wanted to better understand where their soil changed. And so it's actually my father started the company with some friends who had technology for understanding the soil deep in the ground for more geological exploration. And my father had cut his teeth helping with Great Plains. He was an executive there and wanted to adapt some of that sensing technology into an agricultural setting. So he launched this company, Veris, which means truth in Latin, like veritas, verify, and wanted to be able to help take some of that sensor technology with GPS, with the ruggedness of farm equipment, taking lab quality type equipment into the field to be able to go measure where and map where out in the field these soils changed, so that now we can really make the most of the GPS technology, the variable rate controllers, and put it all together. And that's where we started. You know, it's evolved just as I think the industry's evolved and wanting to do a better job with managing. I think a lot of it started with fertility. How do we put fertilizer in the right places in a field to seed population, corn population, nitrogen management. We were talking about yield, understanding yield. Well, yield's usually driven by the soil, and so understanding where the soil changes in those relationships. So where Varus has shifted and grown is helping map other properties. So we've developed additional sensors and more advanced applications with kind of some multi-layer management zones to help with that. So we've tried to add sensors and kind of help farmers more with the actually putting the data to use. That's kind of our evolution over the past 25 years.
Very cool. Thank you for that in-depth explanation. I love the name and where it came from. So I did my undergrad at Harvard. This is kind of a quick aside that we'll probably clip, but I did my undergrad at Harvard, and our motto was Veritas, and
Nice.
we always saw it as verify and truth, and I love that. I saw the name and I was like, there's got to be a story behind that. So it's good.
Well, we just don't like when people confuse it for virus, and they're like, the virus. Once you get it, you just can't get rid of it. And
that's right.
Hopefully, people don't describe our equipment like that. But
that's a huge PR blow right now, especially.
yeah, exactly.
So what different sensing technology units does Veris offer right now on the market?
Yeah, we launched with measuring soil electrical conductivity, which, if to the uninitiated, can often be confused with the EC, or the electrical conductivity that's measured in a laboratory. This is what's called bulk apparent electrical conductivity. This is really measuring the physical characteristics of the soil texture, the particle size, whether it's a sandy soil, silty, clay, and those variations throughout a farm field. And that's the physical property we're measuring. We also have a organic matter sensor, which is an optical sensor that measures soil color, soil reflectance, soil pH. And those are the main agronomic productivity type sensors, the soil type, so organic matter and soil pH. We've recently come out with a moisture and temperature sensor, and that's more used for equipment control, how we're doing improving our tillage strategy, our planting logistics, so that we're getting that seed off to a good start. We also have compaction sensing on a vertical probe that's inserted into the ground. And we'd actually also consider our elevation, our altitude map, when we convert that into slope and curvature, to be another sensor, because it obviously impacts water movement and a lot of different things in a field. So we add that together to say that, we're mapping the most important physical, biological, and chemical properties, and with some of those sensors down to a depth of 3 feet. So those are the soil properties we measure.
Awesome. Why did Varus decide to focus on these specific soil properties, the ones that you just mentioned? Was there initial focus on measuring the properties that were most agronomically important, or that were easily measurable, or what was kind of your thought process behind that?
I'd love to say that we went for just the most agronomically important instead of care for the farmer. I mean, I think some of the sensing technology that we understood at the beginning the best was EC, and so that was a good place. It also happened to be probably the most important contributor to yield in terms of water holding capacity. If you drive across a farm field and yields go, in the combine, the yields go up and the yields go down, it's hardly ever due to, fertility, unless someone's doing a real poor job managing. It's usually due to soil texture. It's due to, the water holding capacity. And if it's not driven completely by water holding capacity, that soil texture is contributing either to high yields or pulling it down from a lot of different factors. Compaction changes with soil texture. Think about a planter going across a field. Well, if that last tillage pass was done when it was wet and clay, you're going to have big clods, and the planter's going to bounce, and you're going to have poor singulation and space, and you're going to have bad emergence, and so yields can go down in those clay parts of the field because of that. We see that a lot with cereals, which don't get as much attention in precision agriculture, but doing variable rate seeding of wheat based on germination, that it's harder to get a good stand in certain soils. So let's jack up the population there. And so, yes, we went with it because it's a foundational soil property, but it's also a technology we knew about. The challenge, some of the challenge when I think people are introduced to soil texture, soil EC mapping is, I can't change it, so why would I map it? And it kind of takes a little perspective change that, no, we're not changing the soil, we're changing the way we manage it. We're changing, hopefully the outcome on it. And we're not going to change that. And we're probably not even ever going to raise up the yield, poor yields to the high yielding areas. We're just trying to reach the potential of each soil. And so that's why we got started with EC. After that, pH was a soil property that, I think a few studies have shown that better management of pH is the most profitable payback in precision agriculture, because it doesn't matter, a lot of the challenge with precision ag is it a wet year, dry year? Did I choose the right hybrid? Well, low pH always needs lime, and a neutral pH never needs lime, year in, year out. It's just a pretty established fact. And so that pH sensor, which we actually worked with a professor from University of Nebraska, Slava Adamchuk, to develop the pH sensor that we license and add on to our sensor. So that was another one, just because instant payback for the farmer. And now we're actually probably getting as much attention from that pH sensor being used on the high pH side of things with, like we talked about, with iron deficiency chlorosis and adding gypsum to fields and kind of managing some on that side as well. And then organic matter, really, that sensor was developed out of a desire to understand more about carbon. I think in the early 2000s, there was a bigger emphasis then, and it's growing back, about how do farmers benefit themselves by storing carbon in the soil, and how can they maybe possibly monetize that and help with climate change. And so we developed a real advanced, robust Vis NIR, with a photospectrometer, many wavelengths of optical sensing to measure carbon for a trading program. And we used that technology, simplified it, and made an organic matter type sensor, which is probably not used much for carbon management right now, but is an important strategy for folks who are wanting to do improve nitrogen management, and they also use that OM layer for variable rate seeding and other inputs. That's kind of the genesis of those different sensors we've had.
That's awesome. We had a speaker last week he was a crop consultant, and said really similar things. You're actually, though, putting it into practice. So he was saying, of course, pH is, the one thing you can really control, go control it. So yeah, that's awesome to hear you say it and how you're putting it to use, putting it to work.
Yeah, there are three things that you said there I thought were really good. So we can't change the soil, but we can change how we manage it, and we can get the maximum productivity out of those regions. Number two, the immediate ROI with pH. And then finally, getting some added value out of data and different cultural practices for farmers. That's something we've been talking about, and we've heard from a couple of our farmers that they're really looking into that carbon sequestration piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, whether it's soil health or soil carbon, just understanding the spatial variability. I mean, that's when we sit down to talk to people about soil sensing. It's kind of like a Tesla pitch. It's not like going by in any other car. You have to sit down and learn about it, and get on board with the cost and what all it provides. But we need folks to start thinking about soil, and so understanding soil matters. That's it's at the foundation of everything we grow. But then thinking spatially. I know you had the space plowboy Terry Griffin on a couple weeks ago. And just thinking about our farm fields is not just spatially I've got the West 80 and grandma's quarter section over here as inside that field. And farmers do that. They understand the variability, but also just thinking about how can I micromanage that variability. And then last is a fusion, is we need people to think fusion, multi-layers, because it's not one property that's that's probably should determine our management zones. And Veris has the benefit of a long history in this industry, but we often, I'd say, we get judged by our yearbook photo, in that EC is all a lot of people know about us because that's what we had on the market first and for a long time. But if we want to get into some of those more value add, how do we advance, get involved with some more advanced properties or advanced management practices, we need to not just use EC. We need to use EC in topography. And sometimes we need to even throw in organic matter, depending on what we want to manage. And that's one of the unique things we've done lately, is what we call application-specific management zones. Because the same zones that are justify where I should put more nitrogen is not necessarily the same set of zones of where I should put more lime. And so having the flexibility and choosing zones based on what we want to manage.
That's super interesting. And talking about kind of the fusion of multiple layers, thinking about this in the context of soil sampling, and particularly grid sampling, how exactly does on-the-go soil mapping, like what Varus does, complement what you would get out of a traditional grid sample to kind of create that fusion of layers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that on-the-go scanning needs traditional sampling for fertility. I mean, we really need to have the lab help us understand certain properties that we're not measuring. So I think that there's a good complements there, and I think we just have to understand what each map is used for, whether it's grid sampling or a Veris map. Is just use it for its purpose. Even the soil survey, I mean, it can be kind of a nice reconnaissance tool if you're looking to buy ground or something like that. But if you go on the website to download the Surgo map, it said there's a warning: do not use this for precision ag. Pretty much what it says, not to be used at this scale. And yet we try to. And so I'd say, bad maps have cost farmers more than good maps have benefited them over the years, because when we get lost driving, it's usually because of a bad map. It's not because we had the wrong car or put the wrong fuel in the car. Well, that would cause a problem too. But so understanding what each map is used for, it can be helpful. I think that grid sampling is especially useful for as a way to identify if there's a potential for hot spots with if there used to be an old hog lot and phosphorus is out through the roof, and so you can look at the results from a grid sampled map and say, all right, I've got some highs and lows and I need to manage that. But what happens when you do get that sample that lands on the hog lot, and that hog lot was right here in that zone? And I know we're doing a podcast and this might all be video, but if you think about some of the challenges, is when you get some of those hot spots, how far are you applying that knowledge from that one sample? Because if you're doing 2.5 acre grid sampling, that's out to 330 feet based on that one sample, and thinking about what happens in between those samples, and then interpolating in between. And so I like the idea of getting a lot of lab data from the field, but then just choosing what map to then apply that information from more. And so some people have adopted the kind of a targeted grid or a shifted grid type basis, where they use a zone map, maybe a Veris map or a yield map, and shift where they take their samples so that they're getting representative places. Kind of like a doctor has diagnostic spots. He takes your temperature in certain places and listens to your breathing and others, then just randomly do it across your body on a pattern that, we go to certain places because we want to get certain information. And I think zone maps can be especially helpful for stuff like that. And then last, if we're trying to do things like seeding rates, nitrogen management, we really have to get the map right in those. Because if you think about fertility, if we're off a little bit on our P and K, it's probably not going to show up in the first year, right? Second year, third year, unless you're right on the cusp. So, if we're just kind of slinging out enough fertilizer, that's probably okay. There's a nutrient bank there. With population, with seed, if you underpopulate your good soil, it's going to show up in the first year. there's no seed bank, but well, someone from last year. And same with the low yielding, the low potential zones, when we're putting high rates there, immediately we're wasting seed. We're causing additional stress on those plants by overpopulating it. And same with nitrogen. Especially if you're an advisor, if you get it wrong, it's going to show up. That yellow corn's going to stick out like a sore thumb. So having the right spatial map for those inputs is incredibly useful. And grid sampling, well, it's very helpful, I think, for getting a baseline of P and K. When we look at some of those other applications, it might not yield the best results for growers.
Mm-hmm. I was going to, someone mentioned to me once about how much like the moisture really influences the EC maps. And so they talked about potentially sampling for moisture to calibrate the sensors. Are there any other things like that, like maybe with pH, that you're kind of calibrating these sensors based upon samples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the, I think, best developments when we came out with the organic matter sensor was we started to encode the data. So, and we created a process where maps can actually come back to Veris and we can review them for just quality control type measures, but also users started providing us lab samples, and we were able to do a validation or calibration where we would take that EC reading and be able to calibrate it to CEC, or cation exchange capacity. Take that infrared reading from an optical sensor and shift it, or use just a regression calibration to organic matter. And same with pH, because pH is nice, but most people want to have a buffer pH. And so we would use some targeted samples, about 4 samples from a field, to do a calibration. And so the additional benefit of just having a lab number and having it validated is now any effective moisture, I mapped this field when it was dry and this field over here when it was wet. And because it's a relative sensor, I can't really compare, the unit of measurement with EC is millisiemens per meter. I can't compare those two, and I can't create a strategy based on millisiemens per meter on those two fields. But once I get it to CEC, I can say, hey, every area that's 15 to 20 CEC, I want to put 100 pounds of nitrogen, whatever that formula or strategy might be. You can start to apply that across your farm, across your trade territory. And it's also been useful when as folks are moving towards models, growth models, nitrogen models, having a fixed number. And so moisture can does impact the Veris readings, but it's just a background relative measure, element of it, as long as it's a consistent moisture across the field. We need to, in your area with pivots, we need to map the corners separately from the pivot and then use some statistical methods to bring those together. But moisture, so that's the direction we would like to go, is calibrate it to a known property where there's a lot of research already done with advice on OM, CEC, pH, and even sand silt clay. We can calibrate the EC to sand silt clay. We'd rather go that direction than using moisture readings to normalize and make a normalized EC map, which, it does some of the benefit, but I think there's more benefit in calibrating it to a lab number.
That's interesting. Good to know.
That is good to know. So obviously we want to keep talking about exactly what Veris does that makes Veris unique. But would you mind telling us a little bit about what other on-the-go soil sensors are out there on the market, and maybe what the pros and cons of these different sensing paradigms are? For example, like with Veris, as far as I understand it, it's an intrusive sensor, so it's actually going to break the soil surface to take some measurements, whereas there are some sensors out there that are basically just, glide over the top, superficial type sensors. So would you mind kind of explaining the difference in those and talking about the pros and cons for us?
Yeah, definitely. There's probably more that have come on the market in the last few years than probably the first 15 years of Veris's existence. And so we really are actually excited about it, because I think, like I mentioned, one of the biggest things we're preaching is soil. And so the more folks who are out there saying that soil matters, we need to map it, we need to manage it, the better. And the thing we have pushed, because we're friends with a lot of people in this industry, that a lot of people who are developing these sensors and promoting them, is using them right. Because when our technology is used correctly and when their technology is used correctly, they make good maps. So the other EC sensor is what's also called EM, is electromagnetic sensing, and that's a way of measuring the same soil property, uses the same unit of measurement. They just, instead of directly injecting electricity into the soil, which is what Veris does, they use a magnetic field, and so it's a non-intrusive way, and it has that benefit of not breaking the soil surface. That would be the benefit from it, and like I said, when it's used correctly, it makes a good map. Veris, I think what we like about the fact that we're touching the soil is that when we're touching the soil, there's no interference. When you're using any type of sensor that's above the ground, anything between this field can cause that reading to shift. And so over the day, as moisture or humidity changes, temperature changes, if you go under power lines, there's a change in magnetic field. If you're in a vineyard and there's magnetic or metal objects around, that can cause interference. Good operators know how to manage around that and still make good maps. Poor operators don't. The other reason that we're okay with touching the soil is it allows us to add additional sensors on that need to engage the soil. And because those other sensors engage the soil, they're typically have metal in them, which does not allow, or historically hasn't allowed, the EM sensor to be around that. I think there's some ways now you can have metal around an EM sensor. So that would be the EM technology. It, like I mentioned, it only measures soil texture, just like Varus only measures soil texture. I think there are companies out there that would like it to measure other things, that like compaction. And while soil texture does relate to compaction, it's not a compaction measurement. The other one that's gaining interest is gamma sensing, which would be a passive measurement of isotopes. And this is, it's kind of it sounds Star Trekky and it seems new and innovative. But we actually looked at the sensing technology in the 90s and we still have some sitting on the shelf. It's a similar, what we found is it is a similar reading to EC, that what's happening is it's measuring decaying isotopes, and it go across the field and it measures the quantity, counts of those, that isotope. Where you have, what we found is where you have clay, smaller particles, more particles, you have higher readings there, and in sandy soils you have less and you have lower readings there. And so it really just ended up being an expensive EC map. And but we're very excited that there could be potential for it to be more. But really what we found, and a lot of university research, actually Slava Adamchuk, who is at University of Nebraska, is now at McGill University College in Canada, did a really a comprehensive study with Veris, all of our sensor suite, the EM and gamma, and users can, or listeners can look up that study. But it really found that our three technologies are measuring soil texture primarily, and there might be some correlation of nutrients that correlate to the soil texture map, but it's not actually measuring soil nutrients in the soil. So that would be the main technologies on the go that we see out there. The Precision Planting has a technology that they put on their firmers, planter firmers, that has an optical sensor, and that optical sensor they're using to estimate moisture, organic matter, and the
Temperature, I think.
Temperature. I think the temperature might be a little different sensor, but it's all on there. And I think that I do know they're attempting to estimate CEC from that same sensing technology, which it's a neat place to put the sensor. really, really impressed by the embodiment, the mechanics of the sensor. That same research that I think was done at McGill and others have found that, and some research we've done, is that optical sensing is a wonderful technology for estimating organic matter, that the soil color is largely driven by that, it's dark because of the carbon in the soil. And the other thing that can make soil dark is moisture. Where there's more or less, it's going to be darker. And using the same sensor for both those, for both those properties can be challenging, and especially also then estimating CEC from an optical sensor. It's asking a lot of one sensing technology.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Just thinking along the lines of the intrusive versus the ones that are just on the soil surface, does the increased adoption of no-till and cover crops, does that influence how some of these technologies work as well, or is it not make a big difference?
There's some hardcore no-tillers who might object to it, but our family farm, we've been no-tilling for 25 years, and we don't object to it. The footprint is about 6 inches wide for our organic matter sensor every 60 feet, and so it's a small percentage that would be touching soil. I think.
I was actually going to say, like, the accuracy of the ones that aren't intrusive. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was saying the opposite way.
Okay. There was a study done in Portugal, actually, that studied using Veris direct contact, or intrusive versus non-intrusive, and that the changes in vegetation on the field did influence that and made it more of a challenge. Yeah.
Good to know. So let's see, where do we want to go here?
Well, I was going to ask, I think you hit on this earlier, but I just want to ask this question because I really like it. So what has on-the-go soil mapping, like the Varus units that you've mentioned, sensors, enabled that was previously unattainable in agriculture?
Profitability. Let's see. I think the neat things are pretty obscure in different markets. There's a thing called the root knot nematode in the South that is a big problem in cotton fields. And to manage it, there's a product called Telone. There might be one other, and it is extremely expensive. The application, I think, is upwards of $100 per acre to kill this nematode.
Wow.
And I think that the real problem is not the cost of the product, but availability. It's a byproduct of carpet manufacturing, something unique like that. And so even just getting your hands on it is challenging. So what happens, though, is the populations of the root knot nematode are elevated or only present in the sandiest parts of farm fields. So people use the Varus map, go out there and find the sandy parts of their field and only apply Telone, the fumigant, in that area, which saves them lots of money, enables them to grow a crop that otherwise wouldn't be possible because of the damage by the nematode. And they're able to conserve the product for only the fields that absolutely need it. There'd be ideas like that in other places. One that's gaining adoption in Western Europe, and I think is going to come here in the U.S. K-State has actually been researching it, is the use of variable rate herbicide based on soil applied herbicides, as we're finding that's growing more and more important to move back, and as our options are limited, is that on almost every label of soil applied herbicide is different rates for different soil types. Yet we go out and put the same rate, and either we're not getting efficacy in certain areas or we're over applying in some areas. And think about atrazine and what damage can be caused by over application and so carryover. So using the pH map too, the properties they care about on that label is pH, organic matter, and CEC, or soil texture. And those are the three properties where soil scanning is capturing. So some of those are kind of, I don't know, more unique. I think irrigation probably would be another one. We haven't seen VRI, variable rate irrigation, become ubiquitous, but at least moisture probe placement to kind of do scheduling, knowing where to put the soil moisture probes, multiple, or putting one in a kind of an average soil type. Is that enough? Do you want some more?
Those are awesome examples. Very specific. That was awesome.
Yeah, I really like hearing about the niche, kind of the niche markets that are potentially coming to the U.S. and that a lot of people may not think about out here in the land of corn and soybeans right now. So
yeah, the herbicides one is interesting because everyone wants to skip to the site and spray type of thing, but I think what you're talking about is a much more attainable and reasonable step. And yeah, I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and it really, getting the problem taken care of before it emerges out usually is a better way of doing it. And a lot of that research has already been done by the companies about what rates are best in different areas. Another application that I think would be more profound on a broad scale for agriculture is something we were talking about before we got on is how we do our trials. Whether it's simple on-farm trials, is understanding the underlying soil properties is important, because if you put one treatment on good soil and one treatment on poor soil, you're not testing your test, you're testing soil. And that happens from on-farm trials to hybrids, to understand, where are we making sure that we either have uniform soil that we're testing on, and that's good for just finding out which hybrid variety needs to be promoted. But then after that, as we move to characterizing hybrids, varieties, we see this with trees in California, vines, grapevines, is that certain varieties like certain soil conditions. They can tolerate low pH, they can tolerate high pH, they like wet feet, they can, these is drought resistant. Well, being able to go now, not avoid variability, and that's some of the testing is avoiding variability. The next more advanced step is exploiting it. Let's go test in some of those areas. Let's get on the side of that hill and put a trial there and just see what survives. And that I think could really help get some improved and tailored products for certain conditions. And a lot of our breeding is done on ice cream soils, as they call it. And really, with the hopeful adoption of more multi-hybrid, multi-variety planting capabilities, we're not just looking for the highest performing, hybrid on good soil. We want what's the best, leaf structure on side slopes. What does really good in, areas with poor drainage, because that's what we have in our farm fields. We don't all have those flat, nice places to farm.
Mm-hmm. You hit it on the head.
Yeah, it's you bringing that up just frustrates me so much right now, because the research that I do is sensor-based fertigation. So right now we're stuck with full pivot links that we have to make treatments out of, and they're 15-degree sectors in the field, and it's really painful because we can't put our treatments, where we have uniform soil types within a certain rep, and so there are certain treatments that just end up, just because of that EC limitation, some of those natural soil limitations out there just do not yield as well. And so some of those treatments just do not, they get the short end of the stick, It's like, this isn't a fair test of what we're doing.
Yeah, that is challenging. And then the challenge will be, even if you had a perfectly pie-shaped field to do your testing on, no farmer has that to go apply that information based on. But right. you need to have it controlled for your testing. And then, the next step is helping them understand what the major soil type in that wedge is, or however it might be.
Yeah, that on-farm research it's just such an important concept. I think almost every interview we've had for this podcast so far, people have said that is probably the number one immediate application of precision ag technologies right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Going back to Terry Griffin, he and I served together on the board at the CARTA, the Kansas Ag Research Technology Association. Just a bunch of farmers get together and do research and geek out about it. But it doesn't have to be, people who love GIS applications anymore. I mean, just trying different things in whole, field strips instead of small treatments is going to probably benefit farmer more than, reading, some farm magazine at times.
Absolutely. What are some considerations for a potential customer of yours to make when trying to decide what the right type of sensor is for their operation?
Yeah, it really depends on what the grower or the agronomist or researcher wants to accomplish. But we've really tried to. We're a precision ag only company. We're not adapting or uh, geological or environmental tools and just hoping it fits the ag market. We're really trying to understand that farmers are going to use this, agronomists are going to use this. So we've created models that hopefully fit their operation. So a typical maybe agronomist or consultant model would be our utility vehicle model, the U3. It can be pulled by a John Deere Gator, a Kawasaki Mule, it can be transported easily. That's measuring all those soil properties, EC, OM, pH, topography, can be used for a lot of different applications. A grower, on the other hand, might be interested in our iScan model, which is able to be mounted to a tillage tool, a planter, side dress bar, a lot of different applications or ways you can mount that. And you can passively be collecting that data while you're doing another field operation. And that's probably one of the more exciting avenues of where Varus is going. Is a lot of our focus has been on inputs. How do we better manage inputs? When we start putting sensors on tillage tools and on planters, we're getting that data. We'll be able to use that in management zones. But man, a lot of these tools now have on-the-go adjustments. Vertical tillage, especially, we've got gang angle, which is throwing more or less dirt, more or less aggressive. We can go deeper. Same with cultivator. Even now, we can change depth on the go without tipping the machine back and forth. All that happens. We have those adjustments because we want to accomplish different things on our fields at different times of the year, but also in different parts of the field. I'm thinking about the areas that when we talked about earlier, when you get into that heavy clay, if you have the same tillage setting that you did on that nice loam soil, you might be going too deep and you're going to be bringing up clods. You're going to be making a washboard. And so when that planter comes back, it's going to have a challenging time getting a good seed bed or the seed planted right. And so getting sensors onto those tools is going to allow us to enable the farmer to do a better job managing each part of those fields. And even if we put on our looking into the future glasses and trying to see what's going to come, that is what I'd say is the first step towards automation. Autonomous farming is we can have an autonomous tractor pretty easily. We already have it, but we need autonomous implements too, because right now it's someone in the cab deciding what changes need to be made back there. And our tillage and planting sensors can really help provide the information about the ground conditions and what's happening to really optimize those settings and feed it into a system to allow automation.
That is brilliant.
Yeah.
I recently heard some more stuff about, kind of John Deere and some of those places really starting to look at automating their implements. And I had not thought about how Veris could tie into that and kind of provide the sensor backbone that's needed to create those control systems for those type of units.
Yeah. I mean, I've been skeptical of AI and I don't know, some of these buzzwords, big data, but I've been doing we're no-till farmers, but we recently had a lot of floods and we had to do some vertical tillage on some fields, and going across the landscape, I just realized it was just hard to imagine wanting to do the same thing on each, on the side slope, on the depressions, going through these different contrasting environments. I got introduced to soil variability by my grandpa when he was teaching me how to plow and disc a field. And there was a far part of the field. He said, that's an alkali spot. And when you get there, you're going to have to downshift because it's real hard on and I was a rebellious kid. So instead of downshifting, I just lifted the machine out of the ground, the disc out of the ground so I could keep going fast and get down to the development area. But that was the realization that there's differences in these fields and we need to manage it. And so Veris can help put gypsum in that alkali area and help flocculate the clay and improve the soil. But also we can help with making sure that all the implements that go across it are smart too, and not a teenage field operator like
That'll help out a little bit.
This could get you getting way off topic, but I was just thinking, we also have some skeptical thoughts about OnTheGo, like you're saying about some new technologies and some of these things. We do work with active sensors that are OnTheGo sensing technologies, and there are challenges with that as well, lag time, the noise in the data. So it'll be interesting how all those are overcome as well with some of the new technologies you're talking about.
Yeah. Noise and bad data is, like I mentioned, the bad maps is a big problem, but noise and stuff like that is. And that's one of the reasons why we set up that quality control process on our maps, where the data actually comes to Varus, and we have a team of individuals who look at the maps, review it, give a report card, call people up, make sure that they are operating the sensors well. And because we need high quality data, it's going to be expensive decisions based on this, and so we need to get it right. And we've seen the market and the industry react to that, and so we've actually had users of those other sensors I was talking about begin sending their data to us for us to review. And so we can now ingest EM data. We've worked with gamma data from the US and actually around the world, and providing that same quality control review, so that and then management zone creation, so that it actually has that stamp of approval, and they have that confidence moving forward that they have a good map.
That's good to hear. We talk about data quality a lot.
Yeah, we do.
Which actually, I was going to ask you this. Are you guys thinking about making or maybe you already have a software that will do management zone generation?
Yeah, again, I think people know Veris for EC. The users of our more advanced platforms and more recently be more familiar with some of the tools we have. We have a cloud-based platform called Field Fusion, and that's where the upload of our maps and where we do our feedback and quality control happens. But beyond that, that's where the namesake Field Fusion is. We're fusing together those different layers into management zones. And so we do have a cloud-based software platform, and that really came out of this, user experience of, I've got all these maps, what do I do with them? And really stepping in and helping people make those, like I mentioned, application-specific management zones. So on that service, we've got a seeding prescription map. We don't tell you what population, we don't know from Salina, Kansas, what farmer in Ohio should, but we do know that these are different soils. They've got different water holding capacity. They likely have different yield potential. And this is where we would say, and we can change rates. Here's a map of, we go back to iron deficiency chlorosis. This is where we see a high risk. It's got high pH. It's a heavy soil. It's the depressional. This is where, if you're gonna, one of the ways you combat it is increasing soybean population, because they're at risk for IDC. This is where you should jack the rates the highest. Here's the next medium zone, and this is, pH is in the 6s. That type of tool. We make the management zones. We give you the tools to put in prescriptions and download it, send it to some of the major platforms, or download it, put it in your own GIS software. But yeah, a lot of those tools, from mapping to prescription, Veris now offers.
Very, very nice. So is that kind of the what's on the horizon and kind of the direction that the company is moving now, or are there also some exciting developments in terms of sensing technologies that may be on the horizon, and you can tell us about a little bit more?
Well, the whiteboard behind me may be blank, but we do have some ideas in the hopper. No, I think we really are. It's fun because we're a 25-year-old startup company. We've got electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, farm kids. I mean, we just love this stuff, and I think we're developing on multiple fronts. Sensor development, for sure. A lot with implement control, and then the other side would be on the agronomy and how do we use this data more intelligently. One of the things that we would love to see more people make use of, you're talking about yield analysis, is how do we look at the soil and the yield together? And one of the more advanced ways we see it is that the soil, if some people say, well, my yield map doesn't look like my Veris map. So the Veris map, what value is it providing me? Well, that's probably a good thing if you know, to some degree, because if they look the same, then actually, well, that would be the best thing, because it means your limiting factor is your soil. If your poor soil yielded poorly and your good soil yielded great, well, you didn't make any mistakes, I guess you could say. I mean, maybe you could have brought everything up. But what we like to analyze is to look at, okay, here's my poor soil, and here's some area that's part of that that's yielding even lower. And here's my good soil, and I've got some that's, you know, high yielding and some that's yielding a medium level. Well, how do I go in there? Do I got a drainage problem, fertility problem? Did my neighbor drift onto my field? But I've got, this is my good yielding soil. Let me look at my yield data and see where I have divergent yields, and I can fix some of those problems, and especially the missing middle. I mean, we like pat ourselves on the back for our high yielding areas and, you know, kick ourselves for the low yield. But that middle area, how much of that middle area is good soil and could be raised up by some sort of management change? And so using those advanced analytics where we look at similar soils but divergent yields, I think can really help, especially crop consultant scouts, to understand what's going on. Go there and figure it out, because we've seen, you know, same soil but 20% yield difference. That's some big dollars that you can fix. That you don't have to fix the soil, you have to fix some outside problem that's probably manageable.
100%. I couldn't agree more. That's looking at fields where I can actually see that the EC map matches the yield is super exciting, because I'm like, okay, well, this really explains a lot of it, and we may be able to say, okay, you've got a compaction area in this particular area of the field because it's a soil type that's very prone to compaction. I actually just had a conversation with a grower yesterday where we were talking through the EC map and saying, hey, these are your most likely factors. Either you're water limited during the year and we didn't have enough irrigation in this particular area, or, you know, it was a compaction issue. We've gone over the field too many times, especially after having a lot of rainfall last year. Maybe this area was especially prone to compaction. It's fantastic being able to kind of pare down what those issues might be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if your yield map and your soil map look the same, then all you have to do is manage those different soils, you know, as a whole, and find out what the optimum strategy is for each of the soils. When they're different, then that's when the complexity comes in. Even an additional layer, you just have more things to explore. But there's also probably more upside that you can explore through some good agronomy, some good scouting.
Is there any other questions? Are you ready for the last one?
I want to get his advice, because I think he's got something good coming for us.
Okay, so what is one piece of advice that you'd offer to our listeners out there, whether those be crop consultants, researchers, or farmers? What would you like to tell them?
Ooh, of all the questions, I probably should have thought through that one ahead of time. I mean, we talked about on-farm trials. I think a lot of this comes down to validating it yourself. They're just, here's a farm magazine right here. You can read a lot of new things are coming out, and maybe it's slowed down a little bit. Maybe the Silicon Valley, you know, angel capital and, you know, is coming down, or venture capital. So we're getting a little less vaporware out there and vapor products, but just trying it and validating it. And I think one of the things that we've benefited from is a lot of scientific review. I mean, we're talking, you guys are grad students, you've used our equipment. A lot of the students have come through, UNL have. And while it's been a challenge to have a rigorous scientific review of our products, once they've been validated, now the pivot is less from do these sensors work to how do we get these sensors to work. And so I would encourage growers, consultants to apply their own rigorous review of products that come out, demand that of their extension agents, their universities, to try things and help understand it, and not to be skeptical or reject it all, because there's a lot of new things that are coming out that probably have value, but not jumping in without doing some research ahead of time.
every time that we get to the end of the season and I start looking at data and I start looking at all these different layers that we've collected, I'm always asking myself or telling myself, I really need to learn geostatistics, or I've got to learn how to use this stuff better, because there's so much stuff out there. It's like, how do we use all of this to improve what we're doing? And it's such a challenging and exciting problem.
Yeah, and I, not to plug our software, but one of the things that I like about Field Fusion is it's user friendly. Even I can use it, because I think for a long time the keys of the castle to precision ag have been held by the computer nerds, and if I don't know how to use ArcGIS or R or some of this advanced, how am I supposed to do it? I don't want to go to some town and do a software class for a week. And so finding tools that are on one hand easy to use, but we don't want to oversimplify it. And then you got, farm management tools that, help with accounting and marketing and marriage advice and, just everything. Where is it? There's just something that I can look at maps and start analyzing and making some decisions without it having to be everything or so simple that it's nothing. That's kind of a challenge. And I think growers will respond to that when they start to see it.
We've seen a lot of examples of where management zones are very much trying to be simplified. They're, only trying to use a couple of layers, or they're always using 3 zones. They're not really thinking it through. So yeah, it's very interesting what you guys are doing, and I'd love to see that platform. So.
I would too.
Yeah, it's a challenge for everybody to try to do it right. We can just use one satellite image and really screw up, or we can use even a Veris map and just try to make it so detailed that even like a little inerrant point shows up as a big blip. I mean, there's things we can do wrong. And so that's where we talk about that quality control method and management zone creation by people who understand soil sensor data, and then giving that to the local folks who know what inputs, what varieties make sense, and apply their knowledge on top of that is a pretty powerful combination.
We'd like to offer a big thank you to Tyler Lund for joining us on the FarmBits podcast. It was great to have someone who has been so involved with the OnTheGo soil mapping since its inception provide some detailed information about the ins and outs of the technology.
There was so much content in that episode, so as happens really too often, I had 2 favorite parts of this episode. One was when Tyler said that we can't change the soil, but we can change how we manage it to get the maximum potential and profit out of different areas of the field. It was such a clear description of what we were trying to do with site-specific crop management in digital ag. My second favorite part of the episode was Tyler talking about some of the important factors to consider with intrusive soil mapping implements and non-intrusive soil mapping implements. There's a lot more nuance there than you might think to the pros and cons of each different soil mapping paradigm or way of going about doing things, including tillage practices and rotational practices.
I thought that was great as well. I love the discussion on how sensors and management zones are not the same for all different applications. The management zones and how we react to soil variability is different for whether we're doing a seeding prescription or a fertility recommendation or even site-specific pesticide applications. For some of these things, we need to be a lot more precise and utilize different layers such as topography and organic matter.
Again, that's a piece of nuance that a lot of people don't think about. Some people think a zone is a zone, but that's not always true. Mm-hmm. So that's a wrap for this episode. We look forward to you joining us next week as we hear a discussion with Dr. Trenton Franz about how exactly measurements from these soil sensors and from soil sampling are converted into. Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback, so if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the views of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.